What is man? Why he is an eternal being and possesses within him a principle that is destined to exist while life and thought and being last, or immortality endures. What is he? He had his being in the eternal worlds. He existed before he came here. He is not only the Son of Man, but he is the Son of God also. He is a God in embryo and possesses within him a spark of that eternal flame, which was struck from the blaze of God's eternal fire in the eternal world, and is placed here upon the earth that he may possess true intelligence, true light, true knowledge. What is man? He is an immortal being. He is a part of the deity. He is the Son of God, and God is his Father. And he has come here to work out his salvation and accomplish the thing he came into existence for. This is what man is. If he lives the religion of heaven and performs faithfully those things God has appointed him to do, that he may increase from intelligence to intelligence and go on with that eternal progression, not only in this world, but in worlds without end. That is Elder John Taylor, February 19th, 1860. John Taylor, who was LDS Apostle from 1838 to 1880, and the third LDS President Prophet from 1880 to 1887. And recently, indeed on Saturday morning, June 14th, there was a revelation by John Taylor, an 1886 revelation pertaining to polygamy, quietly appeared in the Church History Library's catalog. And to discuss this, we have the great honor of having with us Dr. Benjamin Park. Dr. Benjamin Park is Associate Professor of History at Sam Houston State University. He's the author of many great books and articles. We'll put links to these in the show notes, including Kingdom of Nauvoo, and a book I highly recommend if you're Christian listening and you're looking for one book on Mormon history. I think this is indeed the book to get. It's called American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, now out in paperback. Dr. Park, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to join you.
You had an excellent article, I saw at Religion News Service, on this recent publication of John Taylor's 1886 Polygamy Revelation. But let's take some time, take a step back for our audience. Who was John Taylor, and why does he matter?
John Taylor was an early convert to the LDS tradition. He was originally born in Britain, migrated to Canada at some point, and then it was while he was in Toronto as part of a Christian primitivist group that he was introduced to Mormonism via the Book of Mormon. He converts, he joins the church, he migrates, lives with the saints, is added to the quorum of the 12 apostles. By the time the saints move out to Utah, he is elevating up in seniority. And then after Brigham Young dies in 1877, John Taylor, as the senior most member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, then becomes the next president and third prophet of the LDS tradition.
So Methodist background, that's going to be interesting to some of our Christian listeners, but seeking, as you said, this kind of primitive Christianity, New Testament Christianity, and that's one theme I see in the sermons I've looked at. He's big on the spiritual gifts, very charismatic side. And was immediately drawn. Was it Parley Pratt that initially converted him?
Yeah, Parley Pratt was a missionary who converted him. So very early on, he was given ecclesiastical authority. He became one of the ecclesiastical leaders of the church's branch in Toronto before he migrated to join the rest of the saints. He was known for his very bold and dogmatic approach to the gospel. He was not one to cede any ground, especially in theological and historical debates with other Christians. He was known to get into a number of debates with Christians, and that personality, that unwillingness to give an inch, ends up shaping his presidency, because after he became president of the LDS Church in the 1880s, that was a very tumultuous period, and he was not one to avoid a fight. And there were plenty of fights to be had during that time.
What are some highlights in his career more generally? I take it he wrote D&C 135. I mean, he was he was shot, right? I mean, he was just in the room when Hiram and Joseph were assassinated. I mean, he was shot himself.
Yeah. He was one of Joseph Smith's closest confidants. He was still in Nauvoo when most of the Core of the 12 had gone out on missionary efforts, trips during 1844. And he was actually with Joseph and Hiram Smith in Carthage jail when they were killed on June 27th of 1844. He tried to defend Joseph Smith, and he got several bullets as a reward, including one that took a chunk out of his hip. It's actually it's quite surprising that he was able to survive, because there was very crude medical help that he received overnight because after the mob killed Joseph and Hiram, they feared that the mob was going to come back. And so he hid in a jail cell beneath a straw mat and a blanket, just in case the mob came back to finish the job on them. He survived the night. He wrote about the account and his textual record of that, what they define the martyrdom, was later added to the LDS canon of Scripture as Doctrine and Covenants 135. He also wrote a hymn on Joseph Smith's death that was pretty popular for several decades. And so he was both a historical and theological witness in the LDS tradition to several of its most important events, and later on that just added to his importance and his reputation within the Latter-day Saint tradition.
So John Taylor is one of 17 men who have been president of the Restored Church, of the Latter-day Saints. Well, how does he stand out and fit in? So just as an example, with something like the Lorenzo Snow couplet, I was unable to find him quoting it exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, was something like the Lorenzo Snow couplet believed? Was he out of step with some things that were expected? I know Terrell Givens thought his substitutionary language on the atonement makes him stand out a little bit. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not as much of an expert on his theological contributions. He did write a very influential pamphlet or booklet called Mediation and Atonement, which is probably what you're referencing, Terrell Givens' engagement with John Taylor's theology. He definitely was much more willing to engage mainstream Christian thought in much of his writings, more so than Brigham Young, who often tried to differentiate the LDS tradition from Christianity. But probably one thing that makes John Taylor stand out compared to the other prophets is that, other than Joseph Smith, John Taylor was probably the most comfortable in speaking in revelatory language, and that he would record several revelations throughout the 1880s in a "Thus saith the Lord" voice, several of which were added to the LDS Doctrine and Covenants that were published in Europe, although they did not do a new English edition during those years, so they never made it into an English edition. They were quietly removed later on for reasons maybe we'll get into. But he became known as John the Revelator because he was one that was very comfortable and willing to speak in that revelatory language that Brigham Young was never too comfortable doing himself. And I should add, and neither were his successors after him comfortable with doing either.
Right. I've got this unpublished revelations compiled by Fred Collier. I counted, 11 revelations. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but there were plenty. 11 sounds right to me. And he, like Joseph Smith, whenever they faced a crisis, the solution in John Taylor's mind was to dictate a revelation, whereas Brigham Young, he would just dictate an order or a council or have a deliberation. And John Taylor was more in the mold of the founding prophet of, I am prophet for a reason, let me speak with that mantle.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. You mentioned, and I just to quote another LDS scholar, he presided over the church during the most repressive period of its history, and was in fact arrested, right, at one point with George Q. Cannon.
He was arrested not for polygamy. He was arrested there are a lot of complications with dealing with Brigham Young's estate after Brigham Young's death, and that brought a number of legal issues, including a trial of John Taylor and George Buchanan, who were in many ways his successors. George Buchanan is the counselor and John Taylor's president. But what also makes John Taylor distinct is he spent nearly half of his presidency underground, meaning as a fugitive from the law, because there's arrest warrants for him. There are wanted posters. And rather than, trusting the legal system, which he believed would not give him a fair shake, he went into hiding. He gives his final public sermon in early 1885, and he spends his remaining 2.5 or so years moving from house to house in the being hidden by darkness and not making any public appearances.
That you sent me a copy of this. We'll put it in the show notes. This is just an incredible discourse in February of 1885. I mean, he's got some zingers in here. He talks about he didn't know we needed an American Siberia. He's like, these people talk about liberty. I didn't know this was Russia. So he of course mentions that he had been through persecution before. Mentions being shot. He has bullets in him still. He's like, these younger folks, they're going to have to learn. They're going to have to learn, because we're not giving it up. We're not giving it up, And a lot of Constitution talk. Honestly, we recently did a great interview on Ezra Taft Benson, but there were lines in here that were very similar to Ezra Taft Benson.
Yeah, John Taylor and the Latter-day Saints were, in their minds, the greatest defenders of the Constitution, constitutional principles that they felt the American nation was now forgetting. And so when the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1877, the Reynolds v. United States decision, which validated the anti-polygamy laws, John Taylor believed that it was a betrayal of freedom of religion, of constitutional principles. And so it wasn't so much that they rejected that. In their minds, they were the true interpreters of the Constitution, and America was wrong, which I think is something that a lot of us today can sympathize with when we see Supreme Court decisions that we might not agree with, and we're like, actually, that's a divergence from true democratic order and liberty and society. And I think that's how John Taylor and the others viewed it, to where they thought America was a fallen nation, had betrayed its founding ideals, and needed to return to those constitutional powers, which is why John Taylor emphasized it so much in his public discourses.
Yeah, and he kind of champions a more libertarian, classical liberal view of these things, right? I mean, there was a sermon, if I can remember exactly where it is, I'll put it in the show notes, where he was basically saying, I'm hearing too much talk of banning saloons here. So this is him as president of the church saying basically leave people alone. Don't go there. Don't go in those saloons. But every man should be free in his economic interactions. It was striking.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And Mormons are not always fully consistent in their constitutional interpretations and their political ideas, but they definitely took on this brand of libertarian principles. I mean, the Mormon mantra during these years was mind your own business, which we can see obvious reasons why they would embrace such a slogan. Yeah,
let me read this line from his last public discourse, his sermon. Says, these principles are sacred, meaning these constitutional principles of liberty. And the forefathers of this nation felt so and so proclaimed it in the Constitution of the United States and said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, I believe they have violated that, meaning the U.S. government, and have violated their oaths, those who have engaged in these things and passed that law and those who are seeking to carry it out. Congress and the President of the United States and the judiciary and all administrators of the law are as much bound by that instrument as I am and as you are, and have sworn to maintain it inviolate. It is for them to settle these matters between themselves and their God. That is my faith in relation to this matter. Yet by their action, they are interfering with my rights, my liberty, and my religion, and with those sacred principles that bind me to my God, to my family, to my wives and my children. And shall I be recreant to all these noble principles that ought to guide and govern men? No, never, exclamation point. No, never, exclamation point. No, never, all caps, exclamation point. He says, I can endure more than I have done, and all that God will enable me to endure, I can die for the truth. But I cannot, as an honorable man, disobey my God at their behest, forsake my wives and my children, and trample these holy and eternal obligations underfoot that God has given me to keep, and which reach into the eternities that are to come. I won't do it, so help me God. And then it says, here the speaker vigorously struck the book on the desk, and the large audience responded with a loud amen. Wow. What a talk. I don't hear much of that today.
Yeah, you can get that. You can get the energy. You can feel the energy that was coursing through that room. And I think that gets to one of the central tensions that was at play in these debates over polygamy, where John Taylor and the Mormons believe that they were practicing their sincerely held beliefs in practicing polygamy, and that the federal government, in their decision through the Supreme Court, ruled that you might have the freedom to believe what you want, but that does not mean you have the freedom to practice what you want. And that distinction between religious belief versus religious practice that was codified in that Reynolds decision in 1877 ends up being one of the primary foundations through which America defines religious liberty all the way until today. And Mormons weren't willing to abide by it at the point. They believed that this was something central to salvation, something that God had told them to practice, and something that was part of their sincerely held beliefs. And so as a result, Mormons end up practicing what a few scholars have called the longest, one of the longest forms of civil disobedience in American history, that Mormons were willing to disobey federal law and become fugitives rather than give up what they believed were divine principles.
Well, that leads us to, I know there's an 1882 one that could be relevant as well, but on June 14th of this year, 2025, this 1886 revelation on polygamy just appears on the Church History Library's catalog. Will you take us into this, and who may have been surprised and who wasn't surprised?
Yeah. So there's a lot of layers to this revelation. Sometimes it's easy to overlook. On the one hand, a majority of scholars, including LDS scholars and including apologists, had known that this revelation likely existed. We've had a photograph of this revelation that's been around for over a century. We've had transcripts passed around. And of course, Mormon fundamentalists, those who continue to practice polygamy, have long believed it was real. And scholars had largely come to the same conclusion that this is probably a legitimate revelation, even though no one really knew where it existed. Nor should I add that this revelation said anything that's unique compared to John Taylor's other revelations and writings in the 1880s. Nearly all of the principles found in this September 1886 revelation, John Taylor said elsewhere, so nothing of that is a surprise. But this document, this revelatory text, has taken on a mythic air of significance to the fundamentalists in particular, who kind of looked at this document as the primary evidence that polygamy should never have been given up. And the LDS Church, in response to those claims of fundamentalists, have often denied its authenticity. So now we know, due to a document that's in the archive along with the revelatory text itself, that after the LDS Church First Presidency in 1933 put out a statement that, one, denied that the church ever practiced polygamy after 1890, and two, denied that this was a legitimate revelation because people were already talking about this revelation. They called it a pretended revelation that is not valid. That within weeks of the LDS First Presidency putting out that statement, one of John W. Taylor's widows, so John W. Taylor was John Taylor's son, one of John W. Taylor's widows said, hey, not only is that revelation you're calling pretended real, I know where you can get it. And then through a series of conversations, the LDS Church takes possession of that revelation, but instead of correcting their record and saying, hey, by the way, guys, it's not a pretended revelation, it's real, we have it in John Taylor's own hand, they stay silent about it. And some church leaders continue to deny its legitimacy as a revelation. Now, when it appeared without any fanfare, without any announcement, without any heads up. It was just there on the catalog one day. And we could talk about maybe some reasons behind why. But I think it's proven to vindicate a lot of scholars. It's proven to vindicate some fundamentalists who have claimed that it long existed, even though it's silent on other elements of the fundamentalist tale, which we can get into. But it's reminded the Latter-day Saint community of this complicated past and some questions concerning prophetic, revelatory, and fallible teachings that raise interesting questions, I think.
Absolutely. So this is in Centerville, and you mentioned in your fantastic book, once again, American Zion in paperback today, link in the show notes. You mentioned he's being in the underground, going from, I think around 25 different houses. So this happens to be just in one of those houses, right, in Centerville. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the home of John Woolley, who ends up being one of the primary figures in the fundamentalist movement. And so there's long been this fundamentalist lore that John Taylor in September of 1886 was receiving pressure both within and without the church to give up polygamy. And in response to those concerns, he is visited by Jesus Christ and the angelic Joseph Smith, has an entire night of conversation with these divine and angelic personages, comes out, writes down this revelation, tells his close followers that I have been told that in the future the church is going to give up polygamy and we need to find a way to stop this, and then ordains a set of men into a secret priesthood council who are going to perpetuate polygamy should the church ever forfeit the practice. Now, those narratives shared by John Woolley, in whose house John Taylor is staying in 1886, and his son Lauren Woolley, start being told in the 19 teens and 1920s, when you get this growing fundamentalist movement in response to the LDS Church excommunicating those who are still practicing polygamy. And so by the late 1820s, it is well known, this fundamentalist lore of the origins of fundamentalism, that people like John Woolley and Lauren Woolley had been ordained by John Taylor to continue polygamy, that John Taylor wrote this revelation that dictates it, and that became one of the reasons why the LDS Church tried to stamp down on these stories, denied it ever existed, and denied that the church ever practiced polygamy after 1890, which wasn't true. Now that we have this revelation, it confirms one of those elements of the story. It confirms that John Taylor did dictate this revelation, that it was in his own hand, and that they were telling the truth about that. So now fundamentalists are probably going to take it the next step and goes, this confirms our broader story, that John Taylor also believed that the church was going to give up polygamy and that we need to have the secret council. But I should emphasize that we don't have that these documents that came into that the church has made available don't mention anything about the council, don't mention anything about a future prophecy of having to preserve polygamy when the church gives it up. But of course, the fundamentalist is like, hey, if we were right on this thing, that might signify that we're right on these other elements of the story as well.
Right. Before we hit record, I showed you a pamphlet I was given a couple years ago from Missionaries of the Righteous Branch, solely on this revelation, and I was very happy to still have it because the way they frame it. I mean, of course, it's a short revelation. I'll read it here in a second, but it has all the other things, the elements that you just mentioned, and surely they're happy for this edition, right, today.
If you put on your fundamentalist hat, and you're not always going to be comfortable with wearing fundamentalist hats, if you put on your fundamentalist hat, you're going to now be able to say that, look, the church lied about the 1886 revelation. So that means that maybe they're lying about the secret priesthood council, or maybe they're lying about John Taylor predicting the future apostasy of the LDS institution and the need to perpetuate priesthood authority for polygamy. Of course, there's not textual evidence for those other elements of the story, but so much of religion in general, and the Mormon tradition in particular, is often based in these faith claims that don't have contemporaneous documents. That's just how religion works. And so I think this revelatory text in particular is going to fit into this broader theological debate between the LDS tradition and the fundamentalist traditions, even if it's never going to be fully settled by textual evidence.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that, because I think it's important to see what this revelation means and what it doesn't, and what we should understand about what it says and means, and the limits of what that means. And I want to come back in a little bit to 1933, because I think it almost reminds me of Nixon, where the cover-up was worse than the initial scandal, right? 1933, them lying about this seems problematic. But first, just the revelation itself. Let me just read it really quick. And what stands out to you as a scholar? My son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant and how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I not given my word in great plainness on this subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and the keeping of my commandments, and yet have I borne with them these many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times. And furthermore, it is more pleasing to me that men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so, amen. So maybe the first place to start is, what is the new and everlasting covenant, at least a la 1886?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because lots of people, when they first read this text, are like, hey, where's the polygamy? Where does it mention plural marriage? It's just talking about new and everlasting covenant. And so one of the apologetic responses is, well, this revelation isn't even about polygamy. It's saying that the new and everlasting covenant is never going to go away. And the new and everlasting covenant is an umbrella term that refers to all marriages, all sealings under the priesthood order that take place in the temple. And in response to that, I would say that if you look at both the textual and contextual clues, his references to new and everlasting covenant here is clearly about polygamy. Now, new and everlasting covenant as a term predated the practice of polygamy in the LDS tradition. Some of Joseph Smith's earliest revelations referred to a new and everlasting covenant, and so it did seem to have that broad effect. And there were times even later on where the new and everlasting covenant was used in a much broader sense. However, John Taylor in particular, and several other church leaders in general, especially in response to the federal prosecution of polygamy, increasingly spoke of the new and everlasting covenant in synonymous terms with polygamy. Saying now they weren't always consistent in this, but they were fervent when they did speak this way, saying that polygamy was necessary to be fully exalted and at least receive the highest degree of exaltation. That you can be saved, of course, without it, but to receive the highest glories, you had to be polygamous. And so several other of John Taylor's revelations from the 1880s and several of his sermons would often make clear that he's talking about polygamy when he refers to the new and everlasting covenant. There is, for instance, in 1882, he dictates a revelation that basically says that to receive a high priesthood calling, to be in the high upper echelons of the ecclesiastical authorities, you have to enter into my covenant. And then through contemporaneous documents like George Buchanan's diaries, we know that they interpreted that as polygamy. And then we get the textual clues in the 1886 September revelation itself, when he's talking about that there is an attempt to revoke these covenants and that the new and everlasting covenant is under siege is clear. Marriage in general is not under siege. Endowments is not under siege. Spiritual adoptions are not under siege. It's very clear that they're talking about one thing that people are calling to be revoked, and it's polygamy. So I think this is one of those examples to where when you are reading the plain text, it might seem to signify one thing, but as soon as you dip into the textual clues and the contextual background, it's very clear that he's referring to polygamy. Now, apologists can take an approach, believing members can take approach and say that God dictated this revelation to John Taylor, and John Taylor misinterpreted it, that God was meaning, a broader sealing power or whatnot, and John Taylor was wrong. That's fine. You can do that. That's in the realm of faith, though. That's a theological argument. I'm a historian. As a historian, all I can say is interpreting that text within its context. It's very clear that at least John Taylor and those around him interpreted it as polygamy.
This 1882 revelation that you just mentioned, where, in fact, you mentioned in your book, I think even one stake president had to resign, right? It was basically, you practice this or you resign. And you showed evidence that some did resign. The irony is, this is the same one that added Heber J. Grant to the Quorum of the 12. And Heber J. Grant's going to play into this story. So in 1933, will you know, and I'm trying to be as fair and objective as possible. You're the expert here, but this strikes me as dishonest in 1933. But if there's any contextualization we need for this, why is Heber J. Grant putting this forward in the way he does?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So maybe a little background here. After Wilford Woodruff, who is the president following John Taylor, he issues the official manifesto in September of 1890, saying the Latter-day Saint Church is going to cease practicing plural marriages, at least publicly. But the church does not. The church continues to practice plural marriages authorized by the highest church leaders. In fact, several church leaders, possibly even Wilford Woodruff, took a plural wife after the 1890 manifesto. But that then raised problems because when the church finally decided, they issue a second manifesto in 1904 due to another national investigation into their practices. And then again in 1909, 1910, they try to root out the continuing practice of polygamy. And it's only after that point that they start excommunicating those who are practicing polygamy, including John W. Taylor, John Taylor's son, who was an apostle, at whose excommunication hearing he said, hey, I have a John Taylor revelation, my father revelation, in his own hand, saying that polygamy is never going to be done away. This causes problems for the LDS Church because this is an argument that the LDS Church is forfeiting its true principles, its founding doctrines. And as fundamentalists start growing, especially in the 1920s surrounding John Woolley and Lauren Woolley, I think LDS authorities feel under siege and they're not quite sure what to do. And then in 1933, the First Presidency gets a new member, J. Reuben Clark, who in many ways is the primary architect of modern Mormonism. He is told about this threat. He knows the players involved. John Woolley is his uncle. So, I mean, this is a small world of Mormonism back then. And he believes that, okay, once and for all, we need to cut off these fundamentalists. We need to cut them at the root. We can't be patient with them anymore. And so he drafts this memo that denies that there is post-manifesto polygamy. That was a core part of the fundamentalist argument, and denies the polygamous, the John Taylor revelation. It goes under the name of the First Presidency, so that's how Heber J. Grant adds his name to it, even though it's primarily authored by J. Reuben Clark. How do we justify their duplicity? We don't know. We know Heber J. Grant refers to this as a polygamy revelation. In September of 1890, after Wilford Woodruff does the manifesto, John W. Taylor goes to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and says, hey, I found this revelation among my father's papers referring to polygamy never going away. And you know whose diary mentions that? Heber J. Grant's. Wow. So Heber J. Grant is aware of it all the way back in 1890. How do we justify it? I don't know. Again, that's a theological argument. Maybe he forgot by 1933. At the very least, what I do feel comfortable is saying is that they felt that the fundamentalist claims were a direct threat to LDS authority. And so this was what they believed the best way to root it out.
Wow. No, that's very, very helpful. And it's just so for the listener for this to sink in. John W. Taylor was himself a member of the 12. Correct. And
correct.
Then and I don't know if his sidekick is the right way to put it, Matthias Cowley, correct?
Yeah, another apostle.
Another one. So we have at least two continuing to seal or allow sealings with this revelation in mind. How should we understand this relative to canonization?
So I think most Latter-day Saints, and maybe those outside the Latter-day Saint faith, assume that as soon as the prophet dictates a revelation, that is immediately added to their canon. But that's not the case. Even Joseph Smith's revelations had to be sustained by church members, often at a general conference, to be added to the canonical scripture. That's what happened with Doctrine and Covenants revelations. That's what happened with later additions to the Doctrine and Covenants in the 1870s and 1880s. And we have several dozen revelations from Joseph Smith and other prophets that were never canonized, and they're known as just the uncanonized revelations. John Taylor's revelation, this one, the September 1886 revelation, fits into that category because it was never canonized. It was never presented to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. It was never presented to the church. Now, there's good reason for that. The Quorum of the 12 and the church was not meeting during these years because they were on the underground. They're fugitives from justice. So, I mean, it's impossible to expect for them to gather together. Maybe if they did have a public meeting, he would have presented to them and it would have been canonized. We do know that other of John Taylor's revelations, like the 1882 revelation we mentioned before, did go through that process and was added to the Doctrine and Covenants, at least a couple of European editions. Now, so I think some in the church are absolutely correct when they say that this revelation was never canonized. And so they probably feel comfortable saying that this is not binding on the faith. But I think that still, it doesn't erase all the questions, because what does it mean for an LDS prophet to speak in the voice of God, to declare revelatory statements, and then it just not be canonized? Does that mean that that's him speaking as an individual? If it was divine, would God have found a way for them to canonize it? Or is the fact that it wasn't canonized because God stepped in and made sure that it wasn't? I had one person who emailed me after my article came out who said that it was his belief that God removed John Taylor from the presidency because John Taylor was going to lead the church astray by not giving up polygamy. That if you read in the Doctrine and Covenants, the official Declaration 1 from Wilford Woodruff, that includes some supplemental statements from Wilford Woodruff saying that the prophet of God cannot lead the church astray. God would remove that man rather than let the prophet lead the church down the wrong path. And this is evidence that God must have removed John Taylor because John Taylor was not willing to make the right decisions. Again, that's a theological argument, nor do I think that's a pretty widespread belief among the Latter-day Saints, but that shows how, to many, you can be a fallible prophet and maybe even dictate revelations, but they're not fully binding if they don't go through the canonization process.
Wow. Why do you think this year, why June 14th, 2025 in review? I mean, this was not a headline any of us were looking for. You know?
Yeah. I love conspiracy theories. I love, I don't believe many of them, but I think they're fascinating. So, and I have received in my inbox and in the comments on my YouTube and social media channels, plenty of conspiracy theories that are great fun. And please let them keep coming. I don't believe any of them. I think that, and this is going to be a boring answer, I believe that the LDS Church History Department has been going through a professionalization process over the last couple of decades. And part of that professionalization process has involved the LDS First Presidency taking documents that had previously been restricted, passing them over to the LDS archives, those documents being processed and eventually become available for researchers. This happened with Joseph Smith's books of Commandments and Revelations. It's happening with the William Clayton diaries. It happened with the Council of 50 records. I assume that that same process happened with the John Taylor revelation, that at some point the LDS authorities have been, trying to clear out all these documents that had been sequestered from the archives, passing them over to the Church History Department, where they go through a processing system where they are analyzed and eventually, after deliberation, are made available to the general public. I assume that this revelation just went through that standard process. I know it's not sexy. I know it's not exciting, but I think that's the most likely reason.
Do you think they're going to, would you predict they're going to address it at some point, given the fallout?
It's It's a great question, because I will say that one thing that makes this revelation unique compared to the other documents that have gone through this process in recent years is that the other controversial documents received lots of attention from the church to explain to the broader public, this is what the document is, this is what it means, this is why we're making it available now. And by the way, here's a historically accurate way to interpret it within the concept of faith. I mean, the William Clayton diaries are going through that right now, where you have some scholars working on a scholarly edition of these documents that had long been hidden from scholars, now being made available. And this is a multi-year process, because good history work takes time. And the LDS Church History Department in Salt Lake City houses dozens of very qualified and excellent scholars with the highest standards and who do excellent work. It might surprise some listeners to hear that the LDS Church History Department in Salt Lake City probably has the largest contingent of PhD holding American religion scholars in the United States. I mean, they have some phenomenal people. So in other words, they have the people who can contextualize and explain this document in ways that make sense within a faithful context. They've chosen not to do this, which is surprising to me and a bit befuddling to me. But if they were to decide to explain it, I'm sure they have plenty of people who could do that.
So John Taylor's personal motto was the kingdom of God or nothing. What changed? So maybe take us into Woodruff, his mindset. What was the tipping point? Because I don't recall any inkling of Woodruff disagreeing during the Taylor administration, correct?
No.
So what changed?
If anything, Wilford Woodruff dictated his own revelation that was very similar to John Taylor's 1886 revelation. It's known as the Wilderness Revelation because Wilford Woodruff received it while he was out in hiding out in the desert, that basically said the church should never give up polygamy. So the question, what changed, is crucial. So, and I want to emphasize that because sometimes Wilford Woodruff is presented as a very different person than John Taylor. John Taylor never would have given in, and Wilford Woodruff was willing to give in, which on the surface is obviously true. But Wilford Woodruff was as adamant in opposing giving in 1886, 1887 as John Taylor was. What changed? Well, in 1887, the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which further raised the stakes, and it made it so the LDS Church itself can be disincorporated. It meant that so much of the LDS Church's properties can be taken away, including the temples. Legislation made it so LDS Church members can be denaturalized. It meant that they could no longer vote in elections because there was this new polygamy oath where to be able to become a citizen, to be able to vote, you had to do an oath saying that you did not belong to an organization that believed in or practiced polygamy. So if they were to continue, they were going to be disenfranchised as citizens. They were going to lose their temples. The LDS Church was going to be disincorporated. All their materials were in the process of being handed over to the state, and they're basically going to be everlasting fugitives in the United States. And then in early 1890, the Supreme Court decided that all of these recent escalations were constitutionally valid. And so they weren't going away. And it really seems like that the LDS Church was holding out that at some point the Supreme Court was going to step in and vindicate their views on religious liberty. And when it was clear that wasn't going to happen, they realized that, we're going to have to give in. And that's why Wilford Woodruff frames the manifesto as a political compromise, where he says that we are doing this because of this external pressure, because we are going to lose these temples. And I would rather keep these temples and be able to continue practicing the eternal covenants, which we believe are necessary for exaltation, rather than refuse to give in and live as fugitives the rest of our lives, and the church being disincorporated, not being able to operate as a religious entity anymore.
I should have probably mentioned this earlier. The Logan, Utah temple. This is the one temple John Taylor dedicates in May of 1884. I think one of the, just in terms of the architecture, I think it's maybe my favorite of the temples, but it's really symbolic of this time. I mean, it's almost like a castle, to keep the world out.
It's a citadel.
Yes,
It's a citadel. And it's one close to my heart too. My parents and my grandparents, my great grandparents were all sealed in that temple. So it's one
Wow.
that I hold close to my heart as well. And I
Wow. Well,
think about these sacred structures in the context of these debates. Wilford Woodruff, who was acting basically as the president of the St. George Temple during these times, he starts arming the temple, as in like he's keeping guns inside the temple if there is ever a standoff with federal authorities, because these temples become a crux of the argument, because to the federal government, it's in those temples where these polygamous sealings are taking place. And so they want the temple records. They want to take possession of the temple structures. And that's why I think temples end up being one of the turning points for Wilford Woodruff's decision that we have to give up this practice if we want to keep these temples.
when they issue the manifesto, do we have any evidence of the 15, if it was 15 at that time? I know John Taylor made sure the first presidency was 3. Brigham was a little more fluid with how many, but I'm assuming it's 15. Is there any evidence that any of them saw it as a rejection of the principle?
I think all of them, most of them at least, saw it as a pragmatic compromise that probably doesn't have doctrinal effect. I mean, the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles officiates a polygamous sealing just a week after they sustained the official manifesto at General Conference. I mean, that shows how seriously they're taking it. And within a few years, they institute a system through which prospective plural families can get a recommend from LDS authorities, go down to Mexico, and get there and get polygamously sealed. And so there were, on the one hand, they try to find loopholes, right? They say that it's not going to take place no polygamous sealings can take place on American soil. Well, what if we go to Canada? What if we go to Mexico? What if we go on the Salt Lake? And all of those are kind of loopholes. But there are other points where they just did polygamous sealings on American land and just try not to get caught. I think they mostly saw it as a pragmatic decision, a PR stunt that wasn't going to be strictly followed.
The term suspension seems to be one I saw frequently used. Even the transition in Joseph F. Smith, who was in this first presidency, gets back just in time to see John Taylor before he dies in hiding. It was kind of a sad scene where Taylor may not have even recognized him. I guess he was really struggling at that point. But so Joseph F. Smith's doing this Mormonism defined across his career, and early on he includes polygamy, and then you see it drop out. But he never gave up believing it, correct? I mean, I'm trying to shift. Okay, how do we understand it today with even Oakes and Nelson being sealed to more than one woman, where it's, how do we honor the differences, but also the similarity? Did they ever truly reject the principle?
No, they didn't, and they adapted. Now, there are some people who will say we can read the John Taylor Revelation that even if you read it as polygamy, that the church proved correct because polygamy never went away. They still believed it was an eternal principle that whenever spouse dies, a man can be sealed to a woman, and they're both sealed, which, as mentioned, is the case with Dallin H. Oakes and Russell Nelson today. That is adaptation in LDS theology, because in the 1880s and 1890s, church leaders, including John Taylor and others, were saying that unless you're practicing polygamy in life, it doesn't count in the eternities. That, we can seal deceased people to you, and that's going to be your polygamous family in the eternities. But that does not satisfy. This comes up when John Taylor is preaching that you can't be a church leader. You can't receive the highest degree of exaltation without plural wives. And he uses the example of some people that say, well, I'll be sealed to multiple women in the eternities, so that should be enough. And he goes, no, that's not enough. To actually live polygamously, to be polygamously sealed, you have to be sealed to multiple living people. Now, that is adjusted right later as a way to justify that we're still believing in these eternal covenants that are going to last longer. But again, that just shows how this theology and this understanding evolves over the decades in response to changing circumstances.
Who was the first president of the church that was monogamist?
the first president of the church who was monogamous. So Heber J. Grant was monogamous only because his two plural wives had died by the time he became president. And so he only
Oh,
had
okay.
one wife when he was living. But George A. Smith, who succeeds him, is monogamous, and David McKay, following him, was monogamous. So it wasn't until the 1940s that we got an LDS president who was never polygamous. But an interesting thing is that because Russell M. Nelson can be considered a polygamous prophet because he sealed to 2 women in the eternities, he has once again thrown the balance of LDS prophets toward the polygamous camp. Because if you were to line up those LDS presidents who were polygamous in one line and monogamous in the other line, of course, all early ones were polygamous, and then all the ones since the 1940s were monogamous. So the monogamists were starting to catch up until Russell Nelson comes in the presidency, and he once again throws the balance toward the polygamous prophets. So it is still the case now that there have been more polygamous presidents in the LDS tradition than monogamous presidents.
That is absolutely fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. What do you think is Taylor's legacy today? You know, when I was prepping for this, we also recently had Charles Harrell on in his recent dialogue article on Taylor in the Dark Ages. So we're going to have, this will be John Taylor week. But as I'm going through it, I keep bringing up things that I see that are disputed today. He clearly believes in Heavenly Mother, Heavenly Mothers, spirit birth, yet man is eternal. I can see definitely the tension that B.H. Roberts is going to come in and synthesize. But I keep making it about things today, and I think this headline is tending to do that when, more organically, let's say June 13th or 12th or whatever this year. Yeah. What is John Taylor's lasting legacy in the LDS tradition?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not quite sure why. He doesn't play a large, he doesn't take up a lot of space in the public imagination of the Latter-day Saint Church today. Not nearly as much as Brigham Young, and certainly not as much as Joseph Smith. I think there are several reasons why that is, but I think one reason why he's an awkward fit for the LDS Church, why he doesn't play such a major role in the modern church, is because he is a reminder of an uncomfortable period in the LDS tradition. The fact that he spent 3 years of his presidency on the underground as a fugitive from the law with his face on a wanted poster, that type of image does not fit into the clean-cut, patriotic, law-abiding Latter-day Saint faithful that the church has come to be understood as. So I think he is an awkward fit for just historical reasons and theological reasons. His revelations, his speaking about polygamy being an eternal law, and especially these ideas that are associated with the revelation just made public, raise difficult questions for Latter-day Saints who have to either use apologetic arguments to reinterpret this revelation in ways that John Taylor did not mean, or they have to confront the issue of what happens when a president of the church speaks in a revelatory voice, but it's not divine. Does that mean he's fallible? And if he's fallible, does that mean that prophets in general can be fallible? And how do we then determine what a prophet says is of a man and what a prophet says is of God? So I think because of those complicated questions, John Taylor is always going to be a bit of an awkward fit for the modern LDS church.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Park, this has been absolutely wonderful. I can't thank you enough for coming on.
It's my pleasure. This has been a great conversation.